that's not really what I'm focusing on here. What I'm focusing on is the the difference between your native language and the language you want to learn is going to change the way you should approach that language. Um, a lot of language learners make the mistake of trying to get like a heads first dive into a language. That works really well if you're a tourist and you just want to visit a country and use a language just for basic survival skills. But if you're serious about learning a language, it's good to build a healthy foundation before you try to move into, um, more nuanced topics of language learning, like discussion and interaction with locals. The first step when you want to learn a new language, I think, is to size up the task that you're putting in front of you. The more different a language that you're learning is from your native language, the more you need to focus on your understanding of your own language before you start to learn that language. So if you want to become fluent in, say, Arabic, right, and you're a native English speaker, or even a native Spanish speaker, well, actually Spanish might give you a bit of a pronunciation bonus, but a native English speaker, for instance, you really should spend some time learning or relearning about the stuff that maybe you were taught in school, or maybe you missed that. Um, the linguistic properties of your language. You need to really go over the elements of a sentence, how grammar is used, punctuation even, and phonetics like pronunciation and that sort of thing. Another element that I think a lot of adult language learners do not focus on enough is what I mentioned earlier, which is context, right? As an adult, you have a lot of context, and you should utilize that to your advantage. Instead of focusing on what the um, what the simplest concepts are, right, in a language for you to utilize, focus on either the concepts that you use the most in your daily life, um, or focus on, if you're learning a language that has a completely different script, focus on the words that are the easiest to spell, to remember, to pronounce, and to write. And as an adult, you're aware of what a what a complex idea is, right? So if someone mentions like liquidation, right, or something, whatever the word for liquidation is in the language you're learning isn't going to deter you, you know. Um, but if the word for liquidation is more easy to remember than the word for bridge, then perhaps that's a word you should add to your beginning vocabulary list. And that's not to say that that's a good choice no matter the language, because as I mentioned before, you should focus on words as well that you use often. And I doubt people, unless they're in finance, um, use the word liquidation very often. So a great example of this is when I was teaching myself Japanese, the best way, there actually is a technique that I noticed that I'm sure a lot of other Japanese learners are aware of. A technique where you focus on the simplest stroke orders to remember the kanji, right? And I believe the technique is called remember the kanji, actually. Kind of funny. But the technique is extremely useful if you want to actually learn how to read and write Japanese with kanji. You're basically, when you speak to another person, even how I'm speaking now, you're encoding what you're saying, right? Like, if someone asks you how your day is and you say, oh, it's fine, you don't literally mean your day is fine. You don't literally mean that. Not usually, anyways. That's a very strange thing to say if you take it literally. But encoding can endear you to other people, and it also can, give people an idea of your background. It happens a lot that people encode more heavily when they're amongst people that they're more familiar with. And decoding is a person's ability to understand the encoding that you put into a message. And that encoding can give some historical, cultural, or societal background in general. to you as a speaker, and it also can indicate. It can also give kind of a subtext to what you're saying. So improving your communication skills could be as simple as being aware that there's encoding and decoding going on, and asking for clarity in a conversation. And it can be as complex as becoming a great orator, you know? So if you want to speak better to groups of people, one thing that you can do is improve your encoding to make it more nuanced, or to actually reduce the amount of encoding you do when you speak, to speak more plainly and more clearly. A lot of people have difficulty speaking directly with other people, and I don't mean that in a rude or brusque way, but in a manner of being clear about what they mean, saying exactly what they think on their mind, without trying to reinterpret it to make it more appealing or more acceptable. And that can be a good or a bad thing depending on the context, but it's definitely something that can challenge a lot of language learners, because if you're not aware of the encoding and decoding that's going on in a conversation, you aren't aware of the nuance to that because of something else I want to talk about, which is motivation, right? And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it's good to have a goal for why you want to learn a language, but having a goal isn't always enough. You need to have an active interest in the language. And I think one good way of having an active interest in a language that you're learning is to educate yourself, or maybe just immerse yourself. Immersing yourself is also very good, on the culture of that language. Because a language isn't just, the words that you speak. It's also the entire history and background of a region or a people. Sometimes a region, sometimes a people, sometimes an organization. Learning about the culture of a language can really get you kind of not just enthralled, but it can really pique your analytic abilities. When you're learning that language, you can kind of see connections that you otherwise wouldn't notice if you understand the culture of that language, and even its cultural relationship to the culture of your language. So I think learning the culture of a language while learning the language can actually bolster your motivation for getting more fluent, because the more fluent you are in a language, the more you can engage with a culture. For instance, I recently learned about the word kami, right? So for a long time, as an English speaker, a native English speaker, the word kami to me always was just a Japanese word for like a spirit or a god. But as I understand it now, kami is actually a unique term that there really is no true translation for in English. A kami can be a location. A kami can be almost an atmosphere by itself. A kami can be a spirit, and a kami can be a god, but those aren't necessarily direct translations for the word kami. Kami is a very nebulous concept, at least in a Western mind. It's very hard to understand. An inanimate object itself can be a kami, but also some Shinto believers, which there aren't very many in the world, but some Shinto followers will actually believe that there is a spirit that's a kami, which is more in line with how Western minds kind of view kami. Another example is in the German language. There are a lot of concepts that we just don't have in English. There's so many interesting concepts that honestly we just adopt many of them. Schadenfreude is a perfect example that everyone should be familiar with, that exemplifies this basically. There's a lot of things like that. I believe wanderlust is actually a German concept. I'm not sure. I have to check up on that one. But I believe wanderlust is originally a German concept.